Now, what would happen when we were part of the single market is any goods bound for the single market are checked at the first port they enter in the single market. So you could quite imagine a ship coming from the southern Mediterranean, North Africa, maybe landing in, say, Spain, a Spanish port. Some stuff gets unloaded there, but some then carries on to Britain. But because Britain was part of the single market, it would all be checked at that Spanish port. Whereas now, anything at that Spanish port that's for the EU, they will check, but they won't check anything bound for Britain because it's got nothing to do with them. Our standards for us to check. So now everything that comes into Britain should, in theory, be checked. We can't physically do it. We do not have the people to do it. We do not have the facilities to do it. When you are an island where most of your trade comes in through one port in Kent, you can't build on the sea, so you cannot physically build the facilities needed. And of course, it's very expensive to do checking. And it creates extra logjam. So quite a lot of the time, we're not doing checks at all. So we're wide open to smuggling and also criminals passing through unsafe produce because we're not doing those checks. But the paperwork still has to be checked. So all that paperwork still needs doing.
And this is because we're outside of the single market. So we have, in theory,
our own rules.
And also, we're supposed to have implemented a hard border, haven't we? But we are unable to do that because we do not, as you just said, have the infrastructure. We don't have the manpower. So we're wide open at the moment, are we, for anything coming in from outside of the EU from the rest of the world, because it's not being checked if it's bound for GB. So it goes through the EU, arrives at Dover, and it's completely our responsibility to check everything. That's right. And are we doing that?
Yeah. Not enough. In fact, we have in the past year or so started to implement some standards checks. To begin with, we weren't doing any at all. But even now, we're only doing it for the very highest risk goods because ideally we're working on a deal with the EU to try and reduce the need for it. If people may ask, I'll point out a couple of things. People may ask, well, how was it fine not to need these checks at Dover before? And the reason was because there are checks taking place. There were checks taking place on the food, but they would take place at various points during the supply chain. For example, a butcher's gets inspected. Farms get inspected. So every stage of the supply chain, food supply chain, does get inspected. It's just that the EU only inspect for EU standards. So if you've got a producer in Europe or North Africa, an EU inspector isn't going to inspect their standards because we have different standards. Even if they're aligned, it's our standards for us to check. So they all have to get checked at the border, whereas it used to get checked throughout the supply chain. But the other point there is because we cannot physically carry out the number of checks we need, they did a bit of an experiment a couple of years ago. I think this was 2023, if memory serves. It was 2022 or 2023. I think it was 23. But at Dover, they decided, because they weren't doing any checks at the time, standard checks at all. And they decided to do some over a 24-hour period. They checked something like 22 lorries. So it's 20-something lorries. And in all but one of them, there was dangerously unfit food. There were cream cakes mixed in with raw meat juices. There was raw meat just bagged up, no labeling, no like origin or anything like that. There was maggots in some of the stuff, and it was all an absolute nightmare. And you think to yourself, well, how was that going to be sold as food? Because of the cost of living, because of the rising cost of living, a lot of people very desperate, if they can't afford food from the usual places, will get it from wherever's offering it cheap. So basically it was heading to people who are really struggling with money and will just take something because it's cheap.
So where's this stuff being sold, Phil? I mean, I haven't heard of anybody, buying black market food.
Oh, no, they do. And sometimes they've occasionally been caught, but not very often because we'd have to massively ramp up. Like if we can't have the extra staff needed to check all this stuff at the border, then we should at least have extra staff to check elsewhere through the country. But we don't, because that would be extra cost.